Billionaires, known for their humility, naming their kids like their Wi-Fi passwords, and lastly, of course, their offshore bank accounts. But what would happen if these lovely people could get their hands on some real-life dinosaur DNA? Well, we're about to find out. Over the next 100 days, I will be building the ultimate Jurassic World experience. But not for science, not for humanity, but for my own pure, unchecked greed.
Hello, I like money.
Will I create a prehistoric paradise or a financial disaster? Will the guests survive the ticket prices or the Indominus Rex? It's time to get filthy rich or get eaten alive. And to tell this story, it's time to take you back to day one. On day one, you join us on Isla Nublar, the home of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. With a pocket change starting budget of $32 million, it was time to get to work and to earn myself some serious money. I placed down a path for our guests to arrive at, and then all the necessary important early buildings, such as a power station, fossil centre, and expedition site. It was then time to hire some scientists, which we did even though the starter ones weren't the best. Not to worry though, as a billionaire, we love to fire people down the line anyway, so I'm sure we'll have some of that to come. Once we had our scientists, it was time to send our first team for some dinosaur DNA, and I was going to look for the Allosaurus. Once back, I extracted the DNA a couple of times so we'd have the genome for the Allo, and then began to make our very first dinosaur enclosure. It was just going to be a small one to bring in some guests, and I also placed down a Jurassic World's visitor centre. And when I did that, it made me realise something. I didn't even have a dinosaur yet, and thanks to the attraction of our visitor centre, we were already getting guests through the door. Now, why would you visit a dinosaur theme park that you know didn't have any dinosaurs? I couldn't really tell you, but ticket sales meant money. So instead of, actually buying any dinosaurs, I decided to place down a shelter and a restroom, and then a hotel to boost our safety, restroom, and accommodation ratings. And place down some amenities, which amazingly, despite having 0 dinosaurs actually on show, were making me a nice healthy profit. At the end of day 2, I was now bringing in over 200,000 profit per minute, and I was dreaming about my 50th super yacht. I placed down a bubble tea stand so that our guests had somewhere to drink, but of course mostly to help boost that juicy profit. Pardon the pun. On day 5, I discovered the power of the so-called guest attractions. These were essentially fun attractions such as mini golf, a cinema, or an aquarium, and these would boost the appeal rating of my Jurassic World. So, firstly, I opted to place down a lab tour as my first guest attraction, and then this was followed by a spa, because why not relax on an island in Costa Rica, surrounded by precisely 0 dinosaurs? I then of course realised that our guests might like a gym to work out in before hitting the spa, so I placed one of these down. The great thing about these attractions is that they couldn't break out and eat the guests. As far as I could see, they also had 0 upkeep costs. So I was currently raking it in with absolutely 0 risk, which was shown by the latest financials that came across my desk, showing a profit of $360,000 per minute. I did however think that it was probably time that we got some dinosaurs, and instead of creating my own thanks to my dodgy contacts, I had access to the Dinosaur exchange. Now, just like any billionaire, the prospect of getting a good deal was just too tantalising for me, so I opted to buy the unknown herbivore. That's right, I bought a dinosaur that I knew nothing about from the Italian authorities. When it arrived and I watched my $500,000 asset be thrown around on a crane, I realised that I had been absolutely scammed. $500,000 for a single Amargasaurus did not represent a good deal at all. Here was me hoping for a Therizinosaurus or a Dreadnoughtus, but no, we had been 100% scammed. This obviously was very frustrating, but now I had a dinosaur, I had to make sure they were happy, otherwise those pesky animal rights lawyers would be at my door. So with our singular attraction now getting settled in, I made sure that our guests were feeling comfortable with the amount of restrooms and safety shelters on offer, in case the big scary Amargasaurus got out on the loose. However, that night a storm came in and broke a good chunk of my buildings, which was incredibly rude as it cost me money to fix them. The next morning though, things returned to normal, so I continued to place down guest attractions, including a rock climbing attraction and a mini golf course. Once that was done however, and our appeal rating had been boosted a bit, I bought some Microceratuses from the dodgy dinosaur exchange. Sold by the Costa Rica authorities, they came from a reliable seller, and it would mean that we at least had another species in the park for our guests to view, and they also got on with our Amargasaurus, which was a big bonus. They appeared to be happy in their new home, even if they were absolutely tiny, and I wasn't sure how the guests would actually be able to view them. With some extra dinosaurs now in our Jurassic World, it was time to get back to making some money.
Money!
And I continued to place down every single type of guest attraction possible, which included a VR attraction and a bowling alley. I also added some amenities here down this street, as because this was the main high street, meaning there was high traffic, these amenities would be able to get a nice profit. But now we had added all the guest attractions, if I wanted to really rake in the big bucks, it was time to get some star dinosaurs in. And so that Allosaurus genome that I'd unlocked before we'd even officially opened the park was about to come into use. However, before we could create such a large dinosaur, we needed some better scientists. So in classic Billionaire fashion, I fired all the old employees.
Rafe, you're fired. Dan, you're fired. Alex, you're fired.
And got some new better ones in. Even then though, I still wasn't able to create ourselves an Allosaurus, so after sending our scientists off for some rigorous training, it was finally now time to release the Allosaurus. My Jurassic World now boasted the fiercest predator to roam the Jurassic, and was of course our star attraction. To make sure the guests could get a good view of our Allosaurs, I decided to build a gyrosphere attraction, so that our guests could get up close and personal with this predator. I built the track in mind with the idea that we would soon have multiple enclosures close by, meaning they soon would be able to see multiple dinosaurs on this gyrosphere tour. Once the tour was up and running, I took a look inside it, and it was a very nice vibe, but it was kinda hard to see the dinosaurs as they were in the trees, so I decided to add some more in. From the dodgy dinosaur exchange once more, I purchased some Ceratosauruses, who roamed North America at the same time as the Allosaurus, and these two were apparently great friends. These may or may not have been sold by the illegal underground dinosaur trading business in Costa Rica, but if it made me money, I did not care. The Ceratosaurs were delivered later that day on day 10, and checking in on my financials, we were making some truly beautiful profit of almost $600,000 per minute. So I of course added a nice luxury hotel with a view of the Allosaurs, just for our most prestigious guests of course, willing to pay the big money. It was then time to send off an expedition team to look for DNA for the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Ankylosaurus, as we only wanted star attractions in my Jurassic World, as that would drive the revenue. When the guests came back though, I was a bit disappointed that we'd only got one piece of DNA each, so it would be a little while before we introduced these species to the park. But I did want to add another species to the park, and as the carnivores were by far the most popular additions with the guests, I opted for the Albertosaurus. I had these two Albertosaurs airlifted from the hatchery into their new enclosure, as there was no point in spending money on a new hatchery. After watching our new arrivals settle in, I added in some rock and sand to keep their needs looked after, and then watched them square off against each other. I named the victor Bertie and the loser Susie, and these two would be our Albertosaurs, who were ever so slightly less popular with our guests than the Allosaurs. But that didn't matter, as the next financials had come across my desk, and I was on top of the world, as we were nearing $1 million profit per minute. Next up, I had a big attraction in mind, the Tarbosaurus. They may have been brought from the Chinese underground, but that of course didn't bother me, as they were about to make me a ton of cash. The problem was that these Tarbosaurs were a little bit on the needy side, and seemed a little bit difficult to satisfy, but I extended their enclosure a little bit in the hopes they would keep them happy, and then left to attend to some other matters. On the dinosaur exchange, there was another unknown herbivore, and I just couldn't resist the gamble, and was once again scammed as I was given a singular Chunkingosaurus, which I've probably pronounced wrong, cook me in the comments below. I wasn't really sure what to do with this one, as I didn't have a suitable enclosure for it, and it was nowhere near enough of a star dinosaur to justify its own enclosure, so I just put it in with the Amargasaurus and the Microceratus, even though the Microceratus didn't really like it. But I had more pressing matters to attend to, as the Tarbosauruses had broken out. You see, this was an absolute disaster. Not because I particularly cared about the guests being eaten or trampled on, but rather this was going to cost me a lot of money in lawyer fees and affect the park's safety rating, which was quite simply unacceptable. So I had to open the emergency shelters to save those peasants' lives, although I did get some great shots of the Tarbo trampling about 50 people to death all in a row. Eventually though, the capture team managed to get out there and knock out our Tarbo, who I decided to name Mabzo, and believe me, we're going to be seeing quite a bit of Mabzo. Mabzo's mate was also tranquilized, and as I expanded their enclosure as much as I could, I decided that I was going to have no choice but to build them an entirely new one. To be honest, as it was a storm when this was happening, it wasn't a bad time to just recover for a minute while the guests hid in the shelters. The next morning, the remaining guests who hadn't been eaten or trampled to death emerged from the shelter, and with Mabzo and co in a brand new enclosure away from the guests this time, I hope that things could go back to normal so that I can start lining my pockets a little bit more. After I'd finished watching our Tarbosaurs battling for supremacy, I named the other one Mighty, and then prepared to send out my already disgruntled scientists to dig for Megalodon DNA. You see, I have been doing some thinking, and decided that aquatic creatures could be a great investment, as they wouldn't be able to trample the guests down the street and cause me to lose a ton of money. So of course, once they returned from their digging, I immediately extracted the Megalodon DNA, and was then warned about sabotage. You see, apparently my staff weren't happy about being overworked, and they wanted a rest. Quite unbelievable, but as I didn't fancy any more dinosaurs running down the high street, I reluctantly decided to rest them, Although I did almost fall off my yachts when I saw that it would cost $75,000 to rest each one of them. An absolute disgrace. But anyway, with my scientists now rested, on day 30 it was time to start to create my lagoon. I needed to make sure that this was going to be large enough to fit ideally multiple megalodons and then also some other creatures, just so I could have some more species variety, which would be very attractive to my guests. When creating my megalodons, I did decide to mess with the genomes a little bit, just to make sure that they were very nice and social megalodons, as I did not want any of my $2 million assets to fight with each other, as that would be a bit of a disaster. Once that was done, I created my very first megalodon and released it into the lagoon, and with a whopping 2,400 appeal rating, it would immediately become our most popular attraction at Jurassic World. I added a underwater viewing dome to the lagoon, which went nicely with my viewing gallery, so that our guests could have a good chance of getting a great view of our new creature. And as our megalodon had already sent the ticket sales through the roof, I did the natural thing and released a second one. These creatures were not cheap, but the hope was that they would pay for themselves via the increased ticket and merchandise sales. I added some great white shark feeders for our megs to feed from, and witnessed one of them leap out of the water, which I'm pretty sure our guests enjoyed, and hopefully left some tips from. I then checked the finances and saw that despite our new star attraction sending our appeal rating through the roof, the park expansion had actually dropped all of our other ratings, meaning that I now needed to make more restrooms, hotels, and amenities. So I started placing down a hotel, and honestly, considering I could see the megalodon directly from this balcony, I thought this hotel was an absolute bargain at only $1 million a night. And for our lagoon, I decided to buy some archelon eggs as well, just to add a little bit more species variety. I had the eggs delivered to the hatchery, but before I had a chance to release them, I was also given the opportunity to buy some Suchomimus from the Dinosaur exchange. From a reputable seller this time, I put our new species in the old Tarbosaur exhibit, and then released our archelon into the lagoon. Apparently this enormous turtle would be able to coexist with the megalodon, and I added some platforms to the lagoon, just so they would have somewhere to rest, and potentially avoid the massive sharks if they needed to. I was slightly concerned to see that this megalodon disliked absolutely everything due to the aggressive trait, so I'm sure it'll be fine, right? As we now had an enormous amount of traffic near our lagoon, I added some more amenities to rake in that sweet, sweet profit, which now did push us up to well over $1 million a minute, which was just a beautiful sight. I also added some more hotels, as all of our guests were dying for a good view of the megalodons, and then I also jumped at the chance to purchase 2 more Tarbosaurs for a bargain price, to give Mabzo and Mighty some new mates. It seemed that they were pretty happy with their new arrivals, and the 4 of them looked amazing in their enclosure, which I'm sure the Gyrosphere tour ride were also enjoying. Our archelons were also settling in well and enjoying the rocks, so I decided to add even more creatures to our lagoon, and went for the Liplorodon. I got 5 of these eggs from the Dinosaur exchange and released them into the lagoon. The more species we had on show, the better, as I was currently getting penalised for not having 30 different species in the park, so I made it my mission to hit that target, so we would be able to attract the most guests possible for my wallet, of course. Our transport rating was also causing us to lose some park rating, so I built what was a very small monorail system, which would basically take our guests from the Suchomimus exhibit all the way to the lagoon. In reality, it seemed that we had some rather lazy guests, but if it was going to bring in some more money for me, I was happy to give them what they wanted.
Money.
Oh, you know me, I'm all about the
Terry.
business, baby.
And I celebrated this by releasing yet another Megalodon. I think I might have had a bit of an addiction at this point. But releasing this Megalodon seemed to have annoyed our overworked scientists. Apparently 80-hour work weeks were just too much for these poor souls, and they needed a rest.
What?
And as I didn't give any rest around here, they had the cheek to sabotage my power stations. As my park was now making 1.3 million per minute for now, I decided to give the scientists what they wanted and rested them again, but I knew I would be getting my own back later on. After that, it was time to finally look at the most famous dinosaur of all time in the park, and complete the genome for the Tyrannosaurus Rex. For that, I would have to send out my seriously lazy scientists to get some more DNA, and once back, I put them straight back to work in extracting the DNA. I had the enclosure made for the Tyrannosaurs and immediately filled it with plenty of sand, so they would be content in their new habitat.
Hi, how are you?
Early on though, I immediately realised that we had the same problem as the Tarbosaurs, that the enclosure was just not big enough for the 3 Rexes. So I did my best to extend it as much as physically possible, but then also had to take out a little bit of space as I was forced to double wall the full enclosure, as the Rexes were already eyeing up some prehistoric snacks next door. I placed down a brand new swanky hotel with a view over the Tyrant Lizard King enclosure, and then made the decision to open all the shelters as a storm was on its way, and this was going to be no ordinary storm. I mean, just look at it, the whole island was basically shaking. And to make matters worse, it had broken a good amount of my buildings. But at least the guests were in the shelters, which I of course only cared about as it wouldn't be good for my safety rating if a guest was blown into the T-Rex enclosure by a tornado. The next morning, after the storm had vanished, I immediately watched one of our Megs feeding from the shark feeder, and then sent out a team to search for some Quetzalcoatlus DNA. We had the giant of the seas and land, but it was now time to get the king of the skies in my Jurassic World, because big dinosaurs mean big revenue. We didn't quite get enough first time from our DNA trip, but after a quick second trip, I had all the DNA that I needed to make some Quetzalcoatluses. So I smashed down a large aviary, as obviously these are some big flyers and would need plenty of room to stretch their wings. And once this was done, I decided to mess with the genome a little bit, just to make sure that I was going to release a nice hospitable dinosaur and then incubated the egg. Before I could release it though, I received some distressing news, that the guests were complaining that the tyrannosaurs were ill. Turns out this was caused by a lack of open space. Who would have thought that having a pet tyrannosaur would be so difficult to keep happy? Anyway, this illness now meant that I had to place down an emergency vet, as the Rex was now losing health. So I sent out the vet to scan the Rex and hopefully heal it up, and then continue to craft up the Quetz habitat, adding in some water and fish, as well as a viewing gallery. But once again, I was called back to the Rex, as apparently the only way to stop this thing from dying was to give it some more open space, meaning I had to extend the enclosure. Again. Finally though, I was able to release the park's latest attraction, the Quetzalcoatlus, who actually had a higher appeal rating than the Megalodon and the Rex, which I was incredibly surprised to see, but this was now our star dinosaur. So I immediately decided to release another one. With these two now released, I placed down a viewing dome in the middle of the aviary to make sure that our guests could get a good view of our new star attractions. And another great thing that the introduction of our aviary had done was to spread out the guests over the park, which meant that it was time for some more amenities, which of course meant more money. I placed down some food and drinks and of course shopping amenities, and they were all absolutely raking it in, boosting that profit up a little bit more. I then sent out a team to my homeland of the UK to dig for some baryonyx DNA, as they were very friendly with the Suchomimus, meaning that I could actually put them in the same exhibit and not have to worry about them not getting on. I still needed to make plenty of new species to stop me being penalised for having 30 different species, which would unlock some extra ticket sales and income. And so, with that in mind, I sent out a team for the Nothosaurus DNA, which I extracted and then immediately decided that I would release some Nothosaurus into the marine lagoon, because up until now, all of our marine creatures have been getting on so well, it just made sense to release some more species. If only I was to know the problems this would cause. But for now, things were great. Profit was up 14% since the last month, and we were raking it in at almost 1.5 million of pure profit, which was very nice to say the least. But the species variety penalty was definitely bugging me a little, so I decided to build a nice small enclosure next to the allosaurs, where I brought in some stegosaurs from the dodgy dinosaur market for. A little bit of a step back from the marquee carnivores of late, but the Stegosaurus is an iconic dinosaur, and I thought you just can't go wrong with it. I quickly went out of my way to make sure that these stegosaurs were set to be as comfortable as possible, and then began work on a huge enclosure around the back of Jurassic World. It was time for me to succeed where Jurassic World the original had failed, and successfully incorporate the Indominus Rex into the park, to really thrill the guests. After of course seeing the damage that this thing can really do, I decided to put this enclosure right round the back of the park, just in case we had any incidents such as breaking out and eating any possible guests. For double safety precautions, I decided to mess with the genome a little bit, just to have our Indominus behave a little bit nicer than the one in the real Jurassic World had. This of course did make an already expensive dinosaur even more expensive, but I also had to hire a new scientist who was good enough to actually incubate the egg for me. But eventually, once this was done, it was time to release the Indominus Rex. Of course, I was still far too stingy to actually place down a hatchery, so our Indominus had to be airlifted in. And while that was in the process, I was building a new park jeep route. This would go right through the aviary, into the Indominus exhibit, which doesn't seem like a great idea, but there we have it, and then also through the Tarbosaurs and Albertosaurus exhibits. This would be very good for our transport rating, and also help with making sure that all the guests were visible at all times. Our Indominus was now delivered, and I named him Darwin, after the Indominus in our dinosaur ecosystem videos. I was pretty disappointed to see though, that Darwin actually had a lower appeal rating than both our Megalodon and the Quetzalcoatlus. In fact, it was actually only marginally higher than the Rex, so whoever said hybrids were the answer to all our financial worries was clearly wrong. In other bad news though, for some reason my Lagoon creatures appear to be suffering from chronic stress. At first I thought this was utter nonsense. I mean, these animals should try being a billionaire for the day. Now that is really stressful. But no, they actually seem stressed, due to too many creatures in the lagoon apparently. But as nothing seemed to be really happening, I just left them to it for now, and instead released a brand new quest to drown my sorrows about Darwin's poor appeal rating. But I was then called away for an emergency, as the Tyrannosaurs and the Tarbosaurs were now in the same enclosure. When extending the enclosure, I had forgotten to double wall a section of the exhibit, and this was now a code red, as my $1 million assets were fighting each other. I immediately screamed down the phone at the useless capture team to sort this out right away, and I also had the double wall finally put in place all around the enclosures. While the capture team went out to tranquilize the Tarbos, I decided to sell some of my Nophosauruses to see if it would stop my creatures in the lagoon breaking out with chronic stress. But the day just kept getting worse, as I got the day 70 financials, and we were now making less money than we had the previous month. And it was all because our dinosaur welfare rating had tanked. I had successfully introduced an Indominus Rex to the park, which had so far not broken out, and yet I was earning less money. It was a disgrace. And yet, it was about to get even worse, as the capture team had failed to tranquilize 2 of the Tarbos in time, and they had been killed by the Rexes. About $2 million of assets had just been lost right there, and still, my lagoon creatures were apparently stressed, meaning I had to sell even more of them. So I knew I had to get serious about my dinosaur welfare rating if I wanted to return the park to record-breaking profits. So on top of selling some of the marine creatures to reduce their stress a little bit, I had to sort out little issues like Chunky over here being unhappy in his current exhibit. In between sorting these issues, I spent some time doing my favourite task in the world, which was releasing more Quetzalcoatluses, as these dinosaurs were the most popular attractions in the whole park, so I just decided to give the guests more of them. I sold a few more marine creatures, and then rested my scientists, which obviously made me feel sick having to give them some time off. I was still a fair few species off having that desired 30 different species in the park, so I set about building a huge enclosure at the back of the park, where I would basically put down a ton of nice friendly herbivore dinosaurs in, who were all happy to exist with each other. I then saw Bruce the stressed Megalodon had hunted down one of his fellow inmates, which was very rude of Bruce. I bought an Alamosaurus from the Dinosaur Exchange to be our first herbivore in our brand new exhibit, and then released another Megalodon, as I think I had finally stopped our lagoon creatures being stressed after selling almost half of them. It was getting very stormy again though on Isla Nublar, so I made sure to open all the shelters, as I knew that there were likely to be a lot of broken buildings and potentially fences, and I didn't want to pay out any lawyer fees for any eaten or injured guests. The storm continued all the way through the night, and by the time the next day dawned, which was day 80, we had quite a lot of repair work to do before we could once more open our shelters and park gates. And this had caused our profit to fall by more than half, although to be fair, I couldn't really blame them when there were fences all over the place broken, which allowed the Allosaurs to roam free. Once all the repairs were made and the shelters were opened, I did some work on our big herbivore exhibit, and then edited the gyrosphere route to make sure that the big herbivore enclosure was included to the track, just to make sure that all dinosaurs in the park were visible. And for the last 15 days, I had to really focus on just getting as many dinosaurs into Jurassic World as possible. I'd pretty much ran out of room anywhere for any more big carnivore additions, as they all needed so much space and were picky in who they shared with, but creatures such as the Dimorphodon and the Dinokairos would be great additions. The Dinokairos eggs in particular would be a good additions, as this piscivore was actually a pretty popular dinosaur with the guests, and also was happy to share its territory with various herbivores. I added a herd of Struthiomimuses, as these were pretty cheap, followed by a pair of Myosaurs, who I all asked to be delivered into the big exhibit. I then watched our new arrivals, the Dinocairoses, get settled in, before Mabso the Tarbosaur decided to cause more issues and broke into the Albertosaurus pen. Obviously, this wasn't ideal, but as we did have a nearby capture team, we were able to get a team out as quickly as possible, although apparently these two species were going to get on fine anyway, as Mighty joined Bertie at the feeder together before he was knocked out by the capture team. As the size of our park had been continuing to increase, I was needing to place down more hotels, so I placed down another one with a nice view of the lagoon, and then sent out an expedition team for some Barbulodactys DNA, and I probably pronounced that wrong. This flyer would be a great addition to our aviary, and once they were back, I immediately extracted the DNA and had them released into the aviary. Mabso and Co were also back in their enclosure now, but I did suddenly realise that Mabso had been diagnosed with some illness, and he was losing health fast. It obviously didn't help that with 12% health left, he decided to pick a fight of his own kind, but by the time the vet drove through the gate, he was down to 4%, and I decided that I would do the honours and save our absolute menace of a Tarbosaur. For a moment, I had a moment of joy as I successfully shot Mabso with a healing dart, and his life was saved. Then I remembered that I'm a billionaire and was immediately angry that he got ill in the first place and almost died on me. I continued to add a variety of species to our huge herbivore paradise as we were now closing in on that 30 species goal. One of these creatures was the Lystrosaurus, whose eggs came from the UK, and these guys were pretty cute. However, my attention was once more taken away by the fact that our Baryonyx was missing rock in his exhibit, so I begrudgingly gave him what he wanted to keep that dinosaur welfare rating up as high as possible. I bought some Edmontosauruses at a bargain price for the herbivore paradise and had them delivered, and the profit was almost at $2 million now as we creeped up towards that 30 species target that we had in mind. Unfortunately though, all these new species did come with somewhat of a drawback as we now had so many needs to cater to, it was getting pretty overwhelming. This also meant that I had to stomach the placement of an extra paleomedical surgery just so we could look after the dinosaurs a little bit more. This might sound caring, but it's just because low dinosaur welfare meant less tickets, and this was a big no-no. And one of the big reasons that I placed the vet here, especially, is because Darwin, our most expensive but rather boring asset, was losing health fast, so the vet team got out to him nice and quickly and dealt with the issue. On day 90, as we entered the last 10 days of my 100 days of greed and profit, we went fully in on the dinosaur species. I first bought some chasmosaurs from the marketplace who would go nicely with our Amargasaurs and Microceratoses, and then sent out a team to search for DNA for the Compsognathus. Compies were brilliant, nice, easygoing animals who would get on with any dinosaur in their exhibit, exactly what I wanted and what I was looking for. Once the team came back from the expedition, I had the DNA extracted, and soon we were able to release the compies into the exhibits with the Allosaurs and the Ceratosaurs. Let's just agree to ignore the floating hatchery here. And with that addition, we now had hit the 2 million profit mark, and had amassed well over 100 million in the budget. Remember, we started with 32 million, so I was pretty happy with this. It was safe to say that Jurassic World had already become a massive financial success, but I still wanted more. So I bought some dodgy Morrisodreptus eggs from the Costa Rica underground and released them, as they would be another low maintenance species that could be added to the list. I already had some Ankylosaur DNA from early in the project, we went out searching for some Tyrannosaur DNA at the same time, so I chose to send out another team to fetch me the rest of that, so I could finally cook myself up an Ankylosaur, which is exactly what I did, and then had it delivered into what was already a slightly crowded exhibit where our first attraction was introduced. Although, talking of crowded, it was nothing compared to our herbivore paradise, as it appeared that our poor new Lystros were feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of creatures they were sharing with. In the aviary, it appeared that I'd made a bit of an error, as the Barbarodactylus was failing to bond with our Dimorphodons and seemed to be taking them out one by one. So before our Dimorphodons became extinct, it was now time to purchase those remaining creatures so that we hit our species target count. I first went in with another flyer, which was the Gehalopterus, and this tiny bat-like creature eats insects for breakfast, lunch and dinner. My compies were missing some sand, so I added some in to keep them happy, and then sent out a team to get me some DNA for an Oviraptor, who was another small species that could just be thrown in just about any enclosure to increase that species amount. I incubated the eggs, but before I could get around to releasing them, we had a bit of an issue. The Tarbosaurs had broken into the herbivore enclosure and were now on the hunt. I immediately got the capture team out to tranquilize the Tarbos and repair the walls to the enclosure, but it was a bit late for one of our Coryphosauruses, who was murdered by a Mabso, who was once again proving to be the biggest menace of the park. So after this little accident and getting the Tarbos put back in their original enclosure, I decided to bring back the good old double wall masterpiece that was mostly good at containing our dinos at Jurassic World. I was slightly concerned about the effect this may have on the park tour, but then I remembered that my billionaire ass had hired Harry Potter as well. But now the Tarbos were contained, we could finally release the Oviraptors in with their good friends the T-Rexes. And with that, as I added some vegetation on day 100, we had finally hit our 30 species target just in time. This did give our park a nice little boost in revenue, but I still wasn't happy. Now, we might have maximised our income at Jurassic World, but it was now time to cut some costs, which us billionaires absolutely love to do. So there was only one place to start, by firing all the staff.
Rafe, you're fired. Dan, you're fired. Alex, you're fired.
Once their inflated wages were off the wage bill, all I had to do was place some more hotels down for those luxury guests, but lastly, the most important thing I had to do was stop paying my income tax. And everything was suddenly right in the world. My vision for Jurassic World was finally complete, and making well over $3 million of profit a minute, I was finally content. Thanks all for watching my latest vid. Next up we have another ecosystem simulation, which work has already begun on. Leave a comment down below about what you think would happen if a greedy billionaire truly built Jurassic World in real life, And if you do want early access to these videos, consider supporting me on Patreon. I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you all in the next one.